Let's go back.
Hey, Chris. What's up, Jason?
The Remote Ruby
100th episode.
This is the first iteration of a Remote Ruby podcast. My name is Jason Charnes.
I'm Chris Oliver.
Let's celebrate.
Happy episode 100.
Yay!
I'm going to start the episode with 100 reasons I love Honey Badger. That was pretty good, huh?
I love it.
I like it.
I don't have 100 reasons typed out, and it would take me a long time to list 100 things, but
360-degree coverage, error reporting, monitoring, you name it, they got it. And they named their company after a meme.
And they have a fantastic podcast.
They do.
Yeah. I think that rounds up to 100, right?
Yeah. So thank you, Honey Badger, for sponsoring Remote Ruby and keeping it going. And if you haven't checked out Honey Badger, there is a link in our show notes, and tell them that Andrew, Chris, and Jason sent you.
And tell them we love them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Episode 100. How about that? I guess it's been 2 years now, because it was July 2 years ago we started.
Really? So it's been over 2 years. Dang.
I'm pretty sure because, yeah, we started it about the time I started at Podia. So it's been over 2 years.
You've been at Podia for over 2 years now?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I did a Remote Ruby, like the meetup, in April of that year. It was 2018. And then I was like, nobody likes this, so let's make it a podcast. And that was like June or July. And we like trickled out some episodes. And that would mean that we've probably missed like a couple of months worth total, but pretty consistent.
Right.
The only thing I've been this consistent on is my marriage. So
I was going to say, as someone who's never held down a job for 2 years, that's just like a lot to me.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Like I never, until Go Rails, like I never held a job for very long. I remember thinking about like college is the longest time I've ever done like a single thing, you know? I hated being in college for 4 years.
You know, surprisingly, like my first like real job, I held it for 7 or 8 years and then literally changed job 3 times in the next 18 months. I had this really consistent thing on my record. And then I was like, I'm going to go work at a church as an AV guy. And I was like, no, I need to be a programmer. And so then I got a job as a WordPress dev. And then somebody's like, we want to hire you to write Ruby. And I was like, gotta go. But luckily I've been a little more consistent since then.
It sounds like it led you on the right path. So
yeah, it feels like they were good choices.
Yeah, it's weird to think my now wife, which is crazy to say.
Ooh, congrats,
thanks.
Mr. and Mrs. Oliver.
The missus has worked at the same company for like 19 or maybe 20 years now, which is
wow,
fascinating to me. You know, she's moved up the ranks in this big company and went from tech support, kind of like customer support things early days. And I can't even imagine working at the same place for 20 years. That's so strange to me. It seems like something that people would have done, my parents or their parents, you know, stick with the same job for 40 years. Hey, you know, if it works, and like if you're in a company where you can keep changing roles all the time, growing and stuff, that's great.
Shout out Brooke.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
Well, today we are extremely glad to have a repeat guest on our show. Ernesto, you, Chris, and I met at Southeast Ruby the first year. Ernesto was a speaker. And then you came back to the last Southeast Ruby, I think, as well.
Hey, yeah, it's been a while. I think 1 year since we talked in person when things were normal. Actually feels like 5 years ago.
It does.
Yes.
I'm so happy to be here again. I didn't think I was special at all, but then you were like, hey, can you join me from our 100th episode? And I was like, wow, they really like me.
That was it. We were planning it out, and we said, there's no one that can meet our standard for episode 100. And so you were it.
You were like, no, DHH, forget it. We're going to get Ernesto.
But yeah, welcome back. Do you mind giving just kind of brief introduction of what you do, and just for those who maybe aren't familiar with you?
Yeah. So just like you folks, it's been a while since I held to a job for more than 2 years. So I've been doing this for like about 9 years. I'm the founder of ombulabs.com, which is a consultancy. We do a lot of work with Ruby, Rails, JavaScript, and recently a lot of React.js. And a couple of years ago, we launched a service that's all about Rails upgrades called FastRuby.io. So if you have struggled with Rails upgrades, or if you've looked for guides about upgrading Rails, we probably showed up in one of your searches. Yeah, it's been a while since I've been doing this, and I love it. My role has been changing a lot, and I like it. And I'm also like happy that I get to go to conferences and meet cool people like you. Yeah, I think I spoke at Southeast Ruby, the first one many years ago, and that was my very first conference and speaking in English. You know, I'm originally from Argentina, and I'm just super grateful that you took a chance on me. And yeah, we got to meet there, and it's been great to catch up at every conference.
Yeah, that's awesome. I vaguely remember you telling me that was your first talk in English. It was really good. It was the open source. I'm trying to remember open source, like when nights and weekends aren't enough. Yeah.
Yeah, it was around the time I was taking my first steps as a parent and trying to balance like client work and open source contributions and parenting. And it was like very personal to me. You know, it was basically a way to bake in contributions in your workflow. And yeah, I think it's online. I think you recorded a video of that talk, and yeah, it was scary, but also like super exciting to be in this church-like event space and talk to a lot of Rubyists and to meet like other Rubyists like you and Jason and Afdi and Ernie Miller. Anyway, it was super exciting.
Yeah, I will grab the link to that video. And it looks like Andrew might have already done it.
I'm on top of it.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, you nailed it that first year, Jason, with the event place called Ruby that was kind of like a church. So almost too perfect.
I don't even think we looked at any other venues. We knew there were shortcomings with the venue, like parking and places to eat, but we were like, we can't not do it here. Yeah, that was fun. Yeah. Conferences feel so long ago.
Yeah, for real. I'm used to catching up with you guys in person and going out to eat at spending way too much money at some fancy restaurant, after conference day. Or
the dinner club.
Yeah, we haven't been able to do that in so long, it feels like. So next time, are we going to have to go extra hard?
Oh, God. I don't know. The last place we ate was like the Butcher and the Boar in Minneapolis. And I thought I went pretty hard that night there. But also, as I talked about in the last episode, I've been trying out a plant-based diet. So I'm pretty sure if I go hard at the Butcher and the Boar, I might just die, like right there. So
yeah, that would be a pretty extreme night for you.
I've been eating mostly fruits and vegetables. Give me the 96-ounce porterhouse, 25 dinner rolls, 61 mushrooms, and a lamb chop.
Oh, I miss those days.
Oh, I regret to inform you that the Butcher and the Boar had to close down because of COVID. So
what?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My friend who lives in Minneapolis was like, hey, this place shut down because of COVID. So you got lucky to be there with your friends.
Oh, I think you, Chris, and I were talking about going to MicroConf in Minneapolis this year, and like Butcher and the Boar was on the list. Oh, that was going to be like RailsConf 2.0 because it was at the same hotel and everything. But dreams are dead.
Yeah. Did you end up attending the remote microconf version?
I did not.
Me neither.
The value that I got out of the one I've been to is the meeting other people part and networking. Kind of really what I get out of like Ruby and RailsConf and even Southeast Ruby. So it's hard for me to do that online. Like I can do it, but it's a lot easier for me to like take someone's attention for 5 minutes and try to talk to them in person.
I remember in the last RailsConf in Minneapolis, I think that's the first time I met Andrew in a conference. And I was just like, kind of shadowing your group, Jason and Chris, and Andrew came along and I was like, I'm usually shy with new people, so I don't think we talk more than 3 words. And I think there was even maybe Andrew Culver from Bullet Train was there, and you folks were talking a lot about open source and code. And I think Andrew and I were there just, paying attention and listening closely, but we didn't really talk that much.
Yeah, I am also kind of shy in front of new people. So I was like, oh, thank God there's another shy person. We can bond, but like telepathically.
Yeah, I'm the same way. And I just tag along with Jason because he knows everybody. So makes it easy.
That's because I went to all these things and I didn't know anyone. And I'm actually also very shy. And I just was like, I'm going to try and do this. And people are really friendly in the Ruby community. And even if they probably secretly hate me, they at least are very nice to me and I'll take it. So,
well, one thing that Ernesto said is that if you search for upgrading a Rails app, his content will come up. And that is completely correct. And is also why I reached out to him and asked him to be on the show, because I was looking at upgrading a Rails app and I was like, all right, well, what's kind of involved? And I came across FastRuby, which is a blog, and they have a awesome ebook, and it's so much content about upgrading Rails. And I was like, I have to talk to this man, because I was like, it was just such great content. And I was like, people need to know that this exists. So that's why he's on the show, other than the fact that we needed like a stellar guest for number 100.
Well, thank you. Yes. Well, I'm a true believer in the slow and steady approach to, building a brand and building a service. So, FastRuby.io is where it is today because everybody in the team has a goal of 1 blog post per month. And right now we are about 7 senior software engineers. So that means that every month we have at least 4 posts that go out, and we try to blog as much as possible about the problems and the issues and the tools that we use around upgrading Rails. So anything that we think it's cool and everybody should know about, we blog about it and share it with the world. And one of the changes we implemented this year is that we want to be open by default. So every time we are doing something in a private project, we're like, why is this project closed source? Like, why don't we open source it? And there's no good reason we try to open source it.
That's a commendable approach, and one that I have seen resistance from in some companies. And then some companies are like, yeah, it should be open source. So it's always interesting to see like the dynamics at play that kind of lead to those types of decisions. But so on the topic of Rails upgrades, I know I'm going to add like a little precursor here that I've read all your content. And one thing you talk about a lot is before you upgrade Rails, there's a few steps that you kind of talk about. One of them is having a good test suite. So I wondered if we could talk about the kind of things you need to be thinking about if you're even considering, is it time to upgrade Rails? And along with that, what if your test suite isn't that great?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we get that a lot. We have to filter the leads that we get. We get about 2 leads per week. And that usually is someone reaching out, hey, like we need to upgrade Rails. We're running Rails 2.3 and we really want to get to Rails 6. And unfortunately, we have to turn a lot of them down. We have to tell them, well, if you don't have a test suite that covers at least 60% of your code base, then you're not a good fit for us because we don't have the time and you don't have the budget to pay us for us learning all about your business. So if we can't use your test suite to get constant feedback, then it's not going to be worth it. It's going to be way too expensive for you to pay us to put in all the time that we would need to do. If they have a QA team, maybe we'll consider it. Maybe we'll make an exception, but they have to know that it takes a lot more time when you don't have a test suite, because you have the human factor of QA people going in to staging and making sure that critical flow in your application works. And when we deploy, you're not going to be losing money because we missed one part. So yeah, test suites are super important, and they're a good filter for us to find like teams that have been paying attention to something as crucial as that.
So what if you have a test suite that does cover 60%, but the test suite is very non-optimized and it takes like, I don't know, several hours to run? Is that something you're going to consider or even think to ask? I mean, I'm assuming you would think to ask that, but what kind of decision making goes into that situation?
We have had clients with huge Rails monoliths, which, like their test suite would take maybe 2 hours to finish. And that definitely does affect the timeline for the project. One thing we can do for those clients is try to speed it up for them. Sometimes, it's about scaling the number of workers that are running the test suite. Sometimes you can parallelize some of the test suite. When that's not possible, what we can do is look for bottlenecks. Like maybe they're actually hitting a third-party service. Maybe they're hitting an API that they shouldn't be, because you're basically testing that API for that company. So we try to help them in that sense, but we haven't encountered a lot of clients that have test suites that take more than 2 hours to finish. Like I think 2 hours was the top. And we have worked with clients that had like 40 developers working at the same time in the Rails application. The most usual scenario is that they don't have tests and they want us to write tests for them. But then we tell them, yeah, sure, we can do that, but it's not our specialty.
Yeah, because there's so much nuance and like domain specific knowledge that goes into that. If I could pay someone to just write all the tests for me, that would be perfect. But at that point, like you're basically hiring another employee, but paying them more. So
yeah, I kind of dream about a gem that's kind of like a rack middleware that you can install and run in production for a week. And then at the end of that week, it has written integration tests for you. Like I've never started actually working on something like that, but that would be so awesome if something like that existed, that kind of like kept track of every single request that happens in production and then magically writes code for you. That it's not like, 100% a passing test, but it gets you like 80% of the way there. I would love to work on something like that, or sponsor someone to work on something like that. That would be so awesome, because if it gets you 80% of the way there, we could, you could have a developer get that 20% to achieve at least, 50% code coverage, which is better than nothing.
yeah, I share in those dreams. And I would also like to say, I am also willing to sponsor. So if someone out there is even like considering like, oh, that would be cool to write, you now have at least 2 people who are like, hey, I might give you money for that.
I don't remember the name of it, but there was like a Chrome extension or something that would help write system tests based on what you did in the browser. Same kind of concept. And I think this would be, it would be really great to be able to kind of simulate, this is roughly what we want to test, or generate example, data for those tests. So I would love to see more stuff like that, because it's really like, if you're integrating with Stripe or something, you've got to have kind of real webhooks coming in, and then you want to capture those and throw them in a JSON file so you can replay that. And this is exactly something that would make that workflow a lot simpler.
Yeah, I love that idea of the Chrome extension. If that could write like capybara RSpec code for you, that would be pretty awesome. And it would save people a lot of time, like writing all the, because like all the scenarios of around like web integration tests is usually like the same. It's like, go to this page, fill in this fields, and then check that this thing shows up in the next page. But yeah, it's kind of a dream that I've had for a while. Anyway, so if anybody wants to build that, reach out to me. I'd be happy to bounce ideas and talk about that.
Yeah, the gem that Chris is referring to is called Heaven's Door. And there is also I've used a service in the past that will kind of do the same thing where it'll like record your stuff throughout, like as you like play around in the app, and it'll record it and it'll write the test for you, but it's not Ruby specific. And it was also heckin' expensive, astronomically expensive. So it's a hard problem, but if you have good tests, then upgrading Rails is at least doable. What's kind of the next step?
Cool. Yeah. So that's, one of the requirements, having a good test suite. Then the next one would be to have continuous integration working. And hopefully you're using a service that allows you to set up dual booting. So one of the things that you want to do with every upgrade is first try to get it to bundle install with the next version of Rails. Then try to run Rails server with the next version. Then try to run the test suite with it. And with Circle CI and Travis CI, what you can do is set up jobs to run with your current gem file, and you can set it up to run with the next gem file, which is like if you're running Rails 5.2, maybe the next one will be Rails 6.0. And then you do a lot of iterations to get to a point where the test suite passes. And once that happens, then you can do some manual smoke testing to make sure that everything works. But this is a process that could take weeks or it could take months. It depends on how big the application is and then how complex it is as well.
Okay, so dual booting Rails is something I've always been interested in, but I don't know. There's I need to do more exploration into that because I've read some articles and I know it's doable. It sounds complicated, especially if you're you already are in a situation where your test suite isn't great. But okay, let's say now you're dual booting Rails and then you start incrementally, I assume, upgrading at that point. What are some common issues you typically run across?
Some of the issues that you'll find are that some configuration is no longer there. It has changed and now you need to use a different idiom for that. Sometimes the API changes from one version to the other. The great news is that Rails has gotten a lot better between Rails 5 and Rails 6. It's not the same between Rails 2.3 and 4.2. Deprecation warnings were there, but not as much as they are right now in Rails Master. So right now, what you want to do is pay close attention to all the deprecation warnings that are happening in your current build, and that will give you a good starting point to upgrade. Once you make sure that there are no more deprecation warnings in your current build, then you're going to be in much better shape to bump that Rails version. Some of the other common problems are that if you are monkey patching Rails, you're basically touching the private interface of Rails, which is never guaranteed to be the same. So if you're doing that, you're probably going to run into more problems, and you want to get rid of those monkey patches or update them to use the new internals of the next release of Rails. Those are the two that come to mind right now.
You just made me think of a question. So I think people probably tend to think, you upgrade Rails and you're kind of finished at a point. But the reality is, give it another year or two and there will be another version of Rails. Do you encourage people to, once they get up to Rails 6, to continue dual booting against Rails Master? And maybe you don't care about those tests passing, but you want to keep an eye on that stuff so that you're writing everything now as compatible with Rails 6.1 as you can?
We have an article about this, and it's basically how to stay up to date so that this painful Rails upgrade process doesn't happen again. You know, like if you are proactively keeping tabs on Rails master and you're proactively running dual booting on Rails 6 and Rails master, then you're probably going to find issues sooner than if you just forget about it. So if you have, let's say you could have an optional build that runs every night against Rails master. And then the next morning you can see, did the build complete? Did I have 100 errors? And that's a good way to, take the temperature of your application and gradually address some of those issues that are not a problem now, but when Rails 6.1 is released, they're definitely going to be a problem in your application. Another thing you can do is build things like RubyCritic rules that make sure that you don't introduce languages or idioms that are going to be out of date in Rails 6.1. Another thing that came to mind is like dependencies. To go back to Andrew's question, like what are some common problems? Well, dependencies are a big problem. It's never the case. Actually, like we are working on a Rails upgrade project now that has 3 dependencies other than Rails. And it's been running for more than 10 years. But that's like a fairy tale. Like most of the 10-year Rails applications out there have 100 dependencies and they are changing a lot. So you need to make sure that you keep up with the latest releases, not just the patch releases, but also like minor releases and major releases of the dependencies that you have. So you don't just want to keep an eye on the Rails release and the Rails master changes, but also on the other dependencies that are coupled with Rails.
This is the time where I say the thing I say always, which is please strongly version your gems in your gem file. It will make your life easier. I promise. Please make this a thing always.
I'm interested in the idea of like running a build against master Rails each night. I'm curious, and this is just maybe not even a problem, but like I would be worried, I guess there'd be times where like it would run and fail because maybe something got into a master that's still a bug or something. Do you kind of just like, if you're running against that branch each night, do you just kind of not take action immediately, maybe like watch it for a little while before you like jump in and make your app work with the newest version of Rails, since it's not like an official release? Yeah, how do you kind of like temper that?
What you can do is search through the Rails issues, and if nothing has been reported, you can report it as an issue and see what Rails core team says. More often than not, it's going to be reported by someone as well, like not just you. It seems like, I'm not sure about this 100%, but I think Shopify and GitHub are running Rails 6.0 for sure, but maybe they're even running Rails 6.1 in production. Not entirely sure about that. But they are keeping up with the Rails latest changes. So if there is an issue, they're probably going to find it as well and are going to confirm that it's not just your application, it's actually a problem with Rails master.
That also seems like a decent way to get involved in Rails, maybe trying to get PRs in or issues. That seems like a good track to do that. If you ran your application against it every night, you would be one of the first people to find things. That's always been my problem, is I'm like the last to know about things. So
yeah, it's hard to find bugs in Rails to go fix. But if you're running Rails master and you're working on the stuff that is actively changing every day, then yeah, makes a lot of sense that you can find contributions. It gives me a good idea to like, maybe I'll go and dual boot like Jumpstart Pro and then keep it actively working with Rails 6.1 on a regular basis, but like, run GitHub actions against it for CI, but like don't care if it fails or something, just so that it's like in the back of my mind. And when it does ship, I can upgrade to that, maybe even in the release candidates and just be actively using it and ready to go as soon as it drops. I like that.
Yeah, and for you, it could also be a good source of new material for Go Rails or, for any of the screencasts that you do. You can talk about what's coming up in Rails 6.1 and what things they'll need to change with your code base.
Yeah, and I recently did, what was it? I was fiddling with the Appraisal Gem, which is very similar to dual booting your app. Rather than your entire app against a different Rails version, it's your gem against multiple Rails versions. But it's, I think, basically the same concept. And you might be able to dig into that a little bit more if there are differences. But that is really nice to be able to test your gem. Like if you're building Devise and you need to support Rails 4.2 and up, there's a lot of changes in Rails that you probably have to be addressing in your gem.
Yeah, I recently started maintaining RubyCritic, which is a gem to assess the tech debt in your application. It uses things like churn and complexity and flog and a bunch of other tools. It also uses SimpleCov to calculate, what are the files that have the least code coverage. And one of the things that broke recently is the integration with SimpleCov, where there's been a lot of good work happening in SimpleCov between 0.18 and 0.19. But unfortunately, one of the changes broke the RubyCritic integration. And someone found that issue and submitted a pull request that also added appraisal support to test RubyCritic with 0.18 and 0.19 and to make sure that everything works. So yeah, when you're maintaining or creating a library that depends on another library, it comes in really handy to use something like that.
And I'm just going to interject as well that for Bridgetown, I was running it on the new Ruby 3 build and I encountered a bug. So what I did was after reporting that issue, I created a pull request to basically introduce matrix builds, which is a concept in GitHub Actions of running your test suite on different Ruby versions or different versions of whatever. Now the test suite can run Ruby 2.5, 2.6, 2.7, and the latest Ruby. And if you use the actual Ruby setup action that Ruby provides, then you can test head, you can test dev. They give you a lot of customization options there. So if you're thinking hey, when Ruby 3 wants to come out, we want to upgrade, then now's the time to go into your CI. And if they have the ability to do that, to start testing against Ruby 3 as well.
That's a good idea to submit contributions to gems that you use. With Ruby 3 coming, hopefully it will be released in Christmas. But yeah, with Ruby 2.7, there are a bunch of deprecation warnings that are going to be coming out in every single library out there. So if you can actually run libraries with Ruby 2.7.1 or 2.7.2, I think 2.7.1 is the one that still has the deprecation warnings. You can basically submit contributions that are changing the Ruby idiom in any of the libraries that you use. I wouldn't pick Rails because probably everybody has taken care of those deprecation warnings. But if you pick a few good Ruby gems that people are still using and want to address those deprecation warnings, you can just run the test suite of a library using head or Ruby 2.7.1 and then quickly address those deprecation warnings. So it's an idea. I know this episode is not going to come out in Hacktoberfest, but if you participated in Hacktoberfest and want to continue contributing to open source, this is a free idea for you.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, how much do you see Ruby related things that need fixing when you're upgrading apps versus gems and Rails configuration things? My hunch would be that it's probably less Ruby stuff and more Rails configuration and gems and whatever. But I was kind of curious on that. I'm sure that a lot of things with C extensions are a real pain in the butt when Ruby 3 comes out. But, usually you're not just upgrading Rails from 2.3 to 6. You're also going to upgrade Ruby from 2 to 2.7 or 3 or something.
Right. So, yeah, most of the fixes that we apply are related to Rails, not really Ruby. I feel like Ruby has been very stable since Ruby 2.2, probably. So many of the problems we find are related to Rails. Yeah, I would say it's 90% Rails, 10% Ruby. I know that there's a company called Macandra, I think. They're in Germany, and they run Rails LTS, which is, long lifetime or long time support for Rails. And I know that what they did recently is they added support for newer Ruby versions for like Rails 2.3 and Rails 3.0. So one of the first things we recommend our clients is to use Rails LTS, because they have applied security patches. They basically backported security patches to their very old Rails version. And sometimes what you can do when you're using Rails LTS is upgrade Ruby first and then start upgrading Rails.
This is cool. I haven't seen this before, but we'll stick a link in the show notes to Rails LTS. That's cool.
Yeah, Rails LTS is like, for anybody who is going to have a long upgrade process, like that's the obvious first thing to do is go to that, because then you get your security stuff backported. But then I didn't even realize they added support for newer Ruby versions, which is a big improvement. Because if there were things like, gems or something using an old syntax of Ruby that, the newer version doesn't support, then you have to go fork Rails or, do it yourself. And that's a pain in the butt. So if you can use Rails LTS, that'll save you a lot of time and effort. And you can focus on upgrading your app instead of, doing the fixes yourself because they've already done it. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And one service that we're working on that we're going to release in the next 2 weeks, hopefully by the time this episode is out, it will be out in the wild, is a Rails service to keep your application up to date. So we're calling it the Stay Updated service, where you can pay FastRuby.io a fixed amount per month, and we will keep track of all the changes in your application and compare it to Rails Master and what's coming in for Rails 6.1. So if you are running Rails 6.0 and you had a terrible time, painful time trying to do it, the idea is that you will proactively invest in your application's tech debt so that when Rails 6.1 is released, then it will take you days instead of months to upgrade to the next version.
That's awesome, because I could think, especially for your clients, that you help them get up to date. When you help them get from like 4 to 6 or something like that, then you can just say, listen, what if you never had to worry about this again? We'll just take care of this for you. That's the dream, right?
Yeah, we haven't launched it yet, but this is something we have done for some of our clients, and we thought we could package it in a nice way so people can take advantage of this. And at first, we're probably going to do 90% of the work manually. It's going to be an engineer behind the curtain doing all the work, but we plan to automate hopefully like 50% of the work that goes into staying on top of our client's code base and the Rails code base, and basically trying to merge everything to see what is going to break.
Well, I'm really excited for that. I think that's a really cool service.
Yeah, I would totally pay for that.
Yeah, I agree. The thing that you're like, we maybe don't want to budget our time to go and keep up to date, but paying you guys to help is a small price to pay, I'm sure, compared to, the struggle you end up having in the future if you put it off and then you're like, okay, we got to upgrade. And, like we've all heard the stories of GitHub, like forking Rails and going down their path, and they're doing tremendous efforts getting back onto Rails Master, and no one wants to go down that path. And I think this is stuff that probably should have existed a long time ago. It seems like an obvious idea when you say that. So it's a good sign that like these are things that will really help everybody in the community. I'm excited to see that. When do you think you'll have your first version of that coming out?
Yeah, I think the first version, by the time this episode air, will have been live for a couple weeks or 1 week for sure. The tricky part and the last part we're trying to determine is like, where do we draw the line? You know, like it's different when you try to keep up with an application that has 3 dependencies. That's like the simplest scenario. Most of the applications do not fit that case. So where do you draw the line to say, okay, let's say 50 models. Like if you have less than 50 models, you get the basic plan. If you have more than 50, you get the pro plan. And it's like a bunch of money that's, you know, like, like where do you draw the line and how much do you charge? Those are like the questions that we're trying to figure out at the moment of this recording. But we will have it online by the time this airs.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's so many open-ended things there with how vastly different every application is going to be. So I'm sure that there's lots of interesting things you have to figure out because, you know, will you have requirements of having a functional test suite and a CI or whatever is probably a thing you're thinking about too.
Yeah, we will have a requirement that says you need to have a test suite, you need to have CI, and you need to have at least 60% code coverage. Yeah.
It seems reasonable. Yeah, I'll be really excited to see when that comes out. Do you have a landing page or anything that we can share with people?
I will share it with Andrew later. I don't have it up yet, but I will. I promise.
As long as you get to us before the episode airs, then we'll get it in the show notes and we'll make sure people head that way.
I appreciate it.
So can you give us like a list of resources that people should kind of look at next if they're like, okay, I really like what I've heard on this episode and now I'm all charged up and I'm ready to upgrade my Rails app. What should they do next other than like the stuff that we've already listed because that'll be in the show notes, but what are some other things they can look at?
Cool. Yeah, I have a bunch of resources over here. First, if they want to download the complete guide to upgrade Rails, that's our ebook. They can go to FastRuby.io and they'll get an email with the ebook. It covers from Rails 2.3 to Rails 6.0 and also the process that we have been using with our client projects. Another one is the next Rails Gem. The next Rails Gem is very useful for finding incompatibilities between your dependencies and the next version of Rails. It is open source and it will help you with things like dual booting as well. Like you said earlier that you thought it was super complicated, but it's not. It's very simple and Next Rails will do a lot of the work for you. Another one that we use a lot is called Rails Diff. So if you Google Rails Diff, you can see the difference between different versions of Rails in case you want to do it yourself. It's very super useful for us. And finally, Rails Bump is another project that we use often. And you can basically submit your gemfile.lock and it will tell you what dependencies are compatible with which version of Rails. We are helping the maintainer with our sponsorship, and he is going to add more versions soon. I think right now it covers from 4.2 to 6.0, but by the time this airs, it should cover earlier versions of Rails, which would be more useful for your listeners. Yeah, I think those are like the top 4 I can think of. Of course, like the Ruby on Rails official guides are super useful as well, and we use them a lot.
Awesome. Thanks, Ernesto, so much for coming on and giving us some good learnings. There's a lot of great resources in this episode, so make sure those listening, you check the show notes because these are some great resources, and these are all resources I've used as well from just reading all of your content. So thanks for coming on the show and teaching us about Rails upgrades.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me. Congratulations on the 100th episode. I hope you liked it, and also, congratulations to Chris on his wedding. He's
Thanks.
a great man now.
Yeah, it's crazy to think, but yeah, it's exciting. Not married to the game anymore.
Ernesto, thanks for coming on. It was really good to catch up. Andrew, also shout out great interview skills. I just sat here and wanted to listen. So shout out.
I'm working on it.
Cool. Well, hopefully we'll see you again in person at some conference sometime in the future, Ernesto. But until then,
Yeah.
we'll have you on the next major milestone of the Remote Ruby podcast.
Yeah, I guess I'll see you again in number 200, let's say.
Sounds good. See y'all later.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.